Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
They say rent in New Jersey is a nightmare, and I thought I was lucky when I found that guest house. Now I know better. Moving from Philly to a quiet town in northern Jersey was supposed to be a fresh start. The guest house was advertised as cozy, which was landlord speak for small, but $900 a month, with utilities included, sounded like a miracle. The landlord, Mrs. Cartwright, was this tiny, wrinkled woman who seemed harmless enough, even if she gave off weird vibes. She insisted on cash for the deposit, gave me a lease that looked like it had been written on a typewriter, and didn't ask very many questions. At the time, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. I was unpacking on my first day there when I heard it. One clear, deliberate footstep right above me. I froze mid-slice on a box of kitchen utensils. The box cutter slipped, and suddenly blood was pouring from a gash on my palm. Cursing, I grabbed a towel to wrap my hand, but my eyes stayed glued on the ceiling above me. My new place was a small guest house, just one level, and there shouldn't have been anything above me. But for the time being, I was able to shake it off and distract myself with unpacking. Over the next few days, the place started feeling really off. I couldn't really put it into words, but it just felt heavy in my chest to be there. I tried to focus on feeling more settled in. Mrs. Cartwright hadn't opened my text that I sent her about trash pickup, so I went and knocked on the door. Her house sat about 50 feet from the guest house I was renting. It looked perfectly normal, with curtains drawn, a few flower pots on the porch, but she didn't answer. I glanced around to her driveway, and her car was there, so I would assume that she was home. But after knocking a few more times, I gave up. Maybe she was taking a nap. A short while later, I realized that she hadn't yet cashed my first rent check. At first, I didn't care. Free rent, who would complain? But the more I thought about it, it just felt weirder and weirder. Who wouldn't cash a rent check, especially from a brand new tenant? I sent her another text, just to make sure it would be delivered. But she never replied. One afternoon, I was unpacking the last few boxes in my bedroom when I noticed something odd. Inside the closet, nestled against the ceiling, was a small square door with a pull-string latch. It was barely noticeable, blending in perfectly with the peeling paint. And when I saw it, my stomach sank. I told myself it was just an attic access door, nothing unusual, but I still thought back to what I heard on that first night. I grabbed a chair, stood on top of it, and pulled the string. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space above the ceiling. The attic was cramped and stale. I found a single light bulb dangling from the rafters and tugged it on. The space wasn't big enough for someone to stand in, but it was big enough to store things. And there were things. A porcelain doll sat at the edge of a beam, staring at me with its dark eyes. Nearby, a pair of tiny, worn-out shoes looked like they belonged to a child in the 1950s. A stack of books, with their covers rotting away, leaned against the far wall. It didn't look like anyone had touched the stuff in decades. I climbed down, shut the door, and tried to forget about it. But deep down, I felt like I had just disturbed something that didn't want to be disturbed. The noises started again a few nights later. It was past midnight when I heard it, a faint thumping noise, followed by the sounds of shuffling. I flipped on the light and stared at the closet, and after I finally found the nerve, I tiptoed over and silently opened my closet door. I looked up and my chest tightened. The attic door was open. It wasn't opened all the way, just a crack, but that was enough to send my pulse racing. I was sure that I closed it behind me. I am absolutely certain of it. I grabbed my toolkit and nailed the closet door shut. The next day, I bought a heavy-duty lock for both the front door and the closet door. I told myself I was just being paranoid, trying to comfort myself, I guess. But deep down, I knew better. I knew I wasn't alone in that house. A few nights later, I had tried to push the whole thing out of my mind, mostly successfully. I met a young woman named Emily at a brewery, and we really hit it off. She laughed at all my stupid jokes. She also loved horror movies, and she wasn't put off when I told her about the small guest house that I rented. So when I suggested heading back to my place, she agreed. The night was going great. Wine and music and easy conversation. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. Eventually, we started getting handsy, and we were making out. I think we had both started to undress a little bit, when she suddenly shoved me away. She was pale, staring past me toward the hallway. Is this some kind of a joke? I frowned. What are you talking about? It's bad enough you didn't tell me you have a roommate, she snapped. But the fact that you don't even care that he was standing there watching us is sick. I turned so fast I nearly knocked over the wine bottle. But the hallway was empty. What roommate? I said, my voice cracking. Emily was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. I'm not blind or stupid. I saw him standing over there by the closet. My blood ran cold. Emily, I don't have a roommate. Her face hardened. Don't. Just stop. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, leaving me standing there, staring at the locked closet door. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself Emily had just been seeing things, that maybe the wine or the dim lighting had messed with her perception. But I knew better. It was around 2 a.m. when the thumping noises started up again. It sounded like faint footsteps overhead, and then they grew louder, heavier, until it sounded like someone was stomping directly above me. The sounds moved across the ceiling back and forth like it was pacing angrily. My heart pounded in my chest, and I reached for my baseball bat that I kept around for security. Then it stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse than the noises. And then, there were 3 sharp, deliberate knocks on the front door. I froze, and the knocks came again, louder this time. Bang, bang, bang. I couldn't move. I just stood there, clutching the bat, staring at the front door. I stayed awake until sunrise, waiting for something else to happen. But the house was quiet. The next morning, I packed up my things. I didn't care about the lease, or Mrs. Cartwright, or whatever the hell was in that attic. or outside that door. I was done. Mrs. Cartwright's car was still in her driveway when I left. I didn't bother knocking on her door. I didn't leave a note. I didn't care. Because she never cashed my rent check, I stopped payment on it as soon as I got to my bank. Now I'm crashing on my best friend's couch, writing this to warn anybody else who might think they found a deal on a guest house in New Jersey. My mom was watching Jessie, our newborn, and my wife and I were on our way to see a house we hoped to rent. Molly was relocating for work, and we didn't have much time to put things in order. I was excited for the change, though a bit hesitant to pack up our lives and move so quickly. The house was brick and fairly nondescript. There were neighbors a couple 100 yards away on each side, close enough to feel suburban, but far enough to feel like everyone has their own space. Molly pulled up and parked along the curb, even though the driveway was clear. We got out of the car, and as we walked toward the house, a tall man with shaggy white hair came out, shielding the sun from his eyes. He was quiet and weak, and his name, he said, was Mr. Hart. He was a little weird, but nice enough that we brushed it off. He took us around the house, and it was suitable for what we needed, but never something I would have picked out if we had the choice. As we finished the tour, Mr. Hart offered to give us a few minutes alone. Molly had that look in her eyes where I knew her mind was already made. She insisted we should apply. If the approval came back through in a week, we'd be able to move in right after, and she'd only have to commute from our old place for a few days. It did make sense. I agreed and sat in the car while they talked details. When Molly came back, she was beaming. "We're already approved," she said. "He just wants to get rid of the place. He used to live here with his wife, and when she died, he couldn't stay without her. So sad. He hates showing the place. He was practically convincing me we should take it. I already cut him a check." I felt this was kind of odd, but I didn't want to rain on the parade. We were free to move in as early as the next day, and would take care of the paperwork later. When we arrived in our truck, the house key was waiting for us under the mat. A few days passed, and we'd gotten everything in. It was my first time being alone in the house with the baby, with Molly at work. The laundry was in the basement, and while the baby napped upstairs, I went down to put a load in. The stairs came down in the middle of the basement, and then you had to take a sharp turn and walk all the way towards the back to get to the washer and dryer. Above them was this large fluorescent light, encased in a red plastic shield and a metal grate. It basically looked like an emergency light. I turned it on, and it emitted a deep, monstrous hum. Every corner of the basement illuminated in a ghastly, blood-red glow. I couldn't imagine what it was used for, but I certainly didn't need it. I quickly turned it back off and threw the laundry in. As I got to the top of the stairs, I heard a click, followed once again by a deep, familiar hum. I turned around, and sure enough, the basement was once again glowing red. I took a breath and took the first step, then the next. I probably didn't turn the switch back off all the way, and the vibrations of the laundry pushed the light back on. This logical thought gave me the confidence I needed to round the corner and return to the back of the basement, where I flipped the light back off once again. The humming stopped, and I stood in the quiet glow of a single light bulb at the foot of the stairs. I looked again to the red light and saw it had its own plug. I followed the cord and yanked it from the outlet. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the hum again. Pins and needles ran through my entire body. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and turned around. The basement was glowing red. I took one step down. What was I going to do? I took the next. The humming grew louder. I reached the bottom of the staircase and turned towards the light. Just as I confirmed with my eyes that it was still unplugged, it snapped, flickered, and turned off. I stood there for a moment, listening to my own breath. And then, the light came on again. I stepped towards it, and it clicked off. I waited and took another step. It clicked on again. I kept moving across the basement, and the flickering grew faster and faster, the humming louder and louder. The strobing made it almost impossible to see, and the violent vibrations of the humming caused my head to throb. I reached for the grating when every light in the basement went out at once. I ran as quickly as I could, smashing into old boxes and furniture as I made my way by the dim light bleeding down the stairs. I climbed up on all fours and slammed the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. I heard the baby crying in his bedroom. When Molly got home, I could tell that she didn't believe me, even though she saw how upset I was. She went downstairs alone to replace the bulb that had blown out. The red light wouldn't work for her, even after plugging it back in and flipping the switch. Still, she removed the grate and took it down at my request. A few days later, I'd almost forgotten about what had happened. I got a little nervous doing laundry, but with the red light off the wall, I was able to convince myself that Molly was right. We were safe. Jesse was once again down for his afternoon nap, and Molly was working. I was watching daytime TV and unpacking boxes when there was a sudden loud knock on the door. I turned the TV off and wiped my hands, getting quickly to the door. But there was nobody there. I hadn't seen any kids around the neighborhood, but I don't know. I guess I assumed it must have been a joke. I shut the door and went back to the boxes. I was busy and stressed. It was kinda easy to just put it behind me. But then, a little while later, it happened again. I rushed to the door without missing a beat, but once again, there was no one there. I stepped out onto the front porch and took a long look in each direction. No one. I went back inside and decided to check on the baby. He was gurgling in the crib, so I picked him up and walked around with him for a bit before I sat down with him in the rocking chair. Before I knew it, we had both dozed off. Then came another knock, and it was loud. But I was upstairs, far from the front door. How could it have been? My heart sank as I realized the sound hadn't come from the front door. The knock had come from the bedroom door that I didn't remember closing. "Molly?" I asked. Nothing. My heart was throbbing and my mouth was dry. I gently put the baby back in his crib and took a cautious step toward the door. "Molly?" Suddenly came the loudest, most violent beating against the door. I screamed and rushed to press the lock. Falling to my knees, I looked through the crack under the door into the hallway. But there was no one there. I stayed locked in that room with Jesse until Molly got home. I was too scared to do anything else. Molly suggested having my mother come stay for a few days, but I knew I was ready to leave. She wouldn't hear it. "It's just the sounds of an old house settling," she said. "You'll get used to it." As always, she was able to calm me down. I planned to start spending our days away from the house, running errands or visiting the park. The less time in the house without Molly, the better. But not long after that, we were watching a movie on the couch when we were both startled by a large thud directly above us, like something heavy had hit the floor hard. This was Jesse's room. Without saying a word, we bolted up the stairs. We could hear the baby shrieking. As we opened the door, I expected Jesse's crying to get louder, but it remained muffled. The bright moonlight came through the windows, and the heavy antique curtains had been torn down, left in a tall heap on the floor. The crying was coming from inside the curtains. We threw everything aside, digging towards the sound before Molly pulled Jesse from the curtains. Thank God he wasn't hurt, but it was enough of a scare. Molly finally agreed. She'd call Mr. Hart tomorrow and discuss our options. The three of us slept together in one room that night, with all the lights on. The next day, Molly was busy trying to reach Mr. Hart and sort out missing a few days of work, while I repacked the boxes that I had unloaded. The baby never left my sight. Of course, we cared about the money we'd be losing, but it was more important for us to feel safe. I found myself terrified to do anything in that house. We'd gotten a moving truck, and Molly planned to stay at a hotel while Jesse and I went back home to my mother's for a bit. Anything was better than that house. Jesse needed his teething ring, which we'd left upstairs. I didn't want to go upstairs alone, but I couldn't pull Molly from the phone, and it would only take a second. I grabbed a box of Jesse's things and stepped towards the door, but tripped and fell hard, spilling baby clothes onto the large throw rug that covered the original floors. A few of the rooms had rugs like these when we moved in. Somehow, the rug had gotten bunched up. As I bent over to fix it, I instead decided to pull it up, walking backwards towards the center of the room. In the middle of the floor was a large, deep brown stain covering the floorboards, exactly where we'd found Jesse the night before. I dropped the carpet and ran down the stairs to get Molly. But she didn't acknowledge me. She was staring at something, confused. After a few moments, she turned to me and handed me a check. The check she'd written for Mr. Hart on the day we met. It had never been cashed. It had never left the house. Standing in the sun by the truck, I felt a massive sense of relief knowing I'd never have to go inside again. As we loaded up the last of our things, a neighbor we hadn't met yet made his way down the street towards us. "Never got the chance to come introduce myself, and you're already heading out?" "I know, I'm sorry," I said. "We've had a last-minute change of plans." "I was honestly surprised to see anyone come into the place being forward with you," he said. I asked him to elaborate. His wife, she was old and sick, bedridden, but she hated relying on him for everything. She wanted to open the curtains and let some light in, but she couldn't reach him on her own. She pulled over a stool and stretched for the corner when her husband knocked on the door. It scared her so bad they say she fell face first toward the floor, smashed her whole face in. The worst part? Her husband somehow didn't hear a thing, so he assumed she was asleep, and he went back downstairs and made dinner while she bled out on the floor. "Do you know which room that was?" I asked. She had the room upstairs in the front of the house. His eyes lifted to the windows of the room that until today had belonged to my infant son. I felt sick. "Thanks for telling me," I said. "That poor old man. It's so terrible. I just wish he had mentioned all that to us when we met him." The neighbor looked back at me like I had lost my mind. "You couldn't have met him," he said. "The night he found her, he hanged himself in the same room. Mr. Hart has been dead for months." I'm not someone who grew up with any kind of sleep disorder, like sleep paralysis or night terrors. I've always been a very heavy sleeper, which is why this was such a shock to me. We all have the occasional nightmare. I used to think of nightmares as free 3D immersive horror movies. In a weird way, I sometimes enjoyed the thrill of waking up after a nightmare. At the time, I was living with my roommate Patricia, who I called Trish. We had very different work schedules, so we didn't see much of each other during the week. This happened in July. I remember because it was so hot that I had the window AC unit blasting every night, which provided white noise that helped me sleep better. It was during one of those nights that I had the first nightmare, a few days after my ex and I had broken up. Life wasn't exactly great at the time. I don't remember much of the dream, but the part that sticks with me was being in a room full of my family, all silently sitting around a dinner table. Across from me, standing on the other side of the table, was what I can only describe as a creature. It looked like some kind of alien, with horns and claws. It was terrifying, like what you'd imagine a sleep paralysis demon could look like, except I was still fully asleep and dreaming. The next thing I knew, the creature was standing right next to me, staring down. I panicked and started running in my dream until I was in my bedroom. That's the last thing I remember before waking up. My room was pitch black, and the AC was humming on full blast. My heart was racing from the nightmare, and I sat there for a moment thinking how creepy that dream was. Then I lied back down and fell asleep again. The following night, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door wide open. My immediate thought was that Trish had opened it to check if I was home. I got up, shut the door, and went back to sleep pretty quickly. The next day, I texted Trish asking if she had come into my room the previous night. She said she hadn't. I figured it was possible that I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom or kitchen and I just didn't remember. Then, the next night, I had another nightmare. That same demon-like creature from the previous dream appeared again. Instead of being with my family, though, I was in a dark, empty, square room with this creature. It kept getting closer and closer to me. It didn't move its limbs to walk. It just kept appearing closer until it was on top of me, and I couldn't move. The creature took a claw and scratched my thigh. I could feel the pain. And then, nothing. I don't think I woke up right after that. I just don't remember what happened next in the dream. But when I did wake up, and my room was dark again and the AC was on full blast, I felt something on my skin. And when I rushed to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, I screamed. There was a gash on my thigh. I ran to Trish's room and woke her up. We went back to my room together and flipped the sheets off my bed, searching for any bugs, spiders, or sharp objects I could have laid on. Then Trish suddenly stopped, held up her finger and told me to be quiet. We walked over to the AC unit and turned it off, and for the first time in days, the room went silent. That's when we heard something coming from under my bed. That faint kind of sound that comes from someone else's presence in a room. I'm still impressed that neither one of us screamed right then. We looked at each other and without a word, we bolted from the room and out of the apartment. We ran over to our neighbor's house and frantically knocked until he answered. He was an older guy, so we didn't expect him to go fight the stranger for us, but he let us use his phone to call 911. While we waited for the police, we heard the sound of our front door slamming, but none of us made it to the window in time to see who it was. The police arrived and confirmed that the intruder was gone. After the police left, I started reflecting on my dreams and realized what they actually meant. The demon in my dreams had been the intruder. And the night my door had been open, that meant that he or she had probably been roaming around our apartment, maybe even eating our food. To think this person could scratch my thigh so hard it left a mark still disturbs me. But this experience forever changed the way I think about dreams and nightmares.
One night, when I was 6 years old, I awoke to find my mother standing over my bed, staring down at me with a creepy smile on her face. There was something wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was definitely something off. "Mom?" I said. "Yes," she replied. Her voice was flat, monotone. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Watching you sleep," she said. "Why?" But she didn't say anything more. I don't know how, but I knew without a doubt in my mind that whoever I was speaking to was not my mother. It stared down at me and I stared up at it. We maintained constant eye contact. Neither one of us blinked. We both knew that we were playing a game. It knew that I knew, and the trick was to see who would blink first. "Time for Betty Buys," it said. I didn't reply. I just kept staring. "Time to close your eyes," it said. "I'm not closing my eyes," I whispered. I fought against it for the longest time, straining every nerve in my body, desperately willing myself not to blink. Then, very carefully, without turning around or breaking eye contact, it reached behind itself for the closet door, sliding it open soundlessly. When it was fully open, it stepped backwards inside, settling back until only its smiling face and wide eyes were visible. Then, just as carefully, just as silently, it slid the closet door shut again. I lay there for a long time, silently trembling with fear. I kept my eyes trained on the closet door, watching for any sign of movement. Slowly, ever so slowly, I slid out of bed, keeping my eyes on the closet door. Cautiously, I took 3 or 4 steps to my right until I came to the bedroom doorway. Never for one moment did I take my eyes off that closet. Then I made a run for it. I sprinted across the dark hallway and into the safety of my mother's bedroom. She was lying there in her bed, sleeping peacefully. A wave of terror washed over me as my worst fears were confirmed. And only then did I allow myself to blink.
What I'm about to tell you is the reason why my parents moved out of a house that's been in our family for 3 generations. I've struggled with depression for most of my life. It's always been hard for me to shake the feeling of being useless. I'm doing better now, but when I was a kid, it was much worse. Because of that, I spent a lot of time alone in my room. Our house was nestled in a very woodsy area, with trees on 3 sides of it and a forest separating us from any neighbors. My room was pretty big for a bedroom, located in the back corner of the house. The windows on 2 of the walls faced the woods. For a kid my age, who was still afraid of the dark, it was honestly pretty terrifying. Things started when I was about 10 years old, in 5th grade. It was the age where it was no longer acceptable to sleep in my parents' bed after a nightmare. The first thing I noticed was my nightlight. It had different color settings, so I could change the LED if I wanted to. I usually kept it on red, which is how I fell asleep most nights. One night, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night, and I noticed that the nightlight had turned blue. But I fell back to sleep almost immediately, and didn't think anything of it at the time. When it happened again a week later, I asked my parents why they were messing with it when I was asleep, but they seemed genuinely confused and said they hadn't touched it. They just shrugged it off, suggesting that the nightlight had always been glitchy. They seemed pretty sure of themselves, so I accepted it, at least for a little while. Then one morning, I woke up and my nightlight was completely unplugged from the wall, lying on the floor in the center of the room. I told my parents, but once again they dismissed it. My dad said I was getting too old for a nightlight anyway, and that I needed to focus on school. A few days later, my nightlight vanished completely. I was convinced my parents were lying to me, and that they had taken it away to force me to outgrow it. This led to a massive fight between us. Both sides accused the other of hiding the nightlight, and nobody was budging. I couldn't believe my parents would lie to me like that over something like this, but there was nothing I could do to prove it. After that, things went back to normal for about a week. But then, 3 nights in a row, I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. Each time I had no idea what had awoken me. On the 4th night, when it happened again, I told my parents. They said it was just puberty and that changes in my sleep were natural. So the next time it happened, I forced myself to stay awake instead of falling back asleep. And a few minutes after I woke up, I heard faint rustling noises coming from my closet. I told my parents in the morning, but they didn't believe me. The next 4 days were the most traumatizing nights of my life. Every night, I woke up to rustling sounds coming from the closet. It was torture. I couldn't take it anymore, and I begged my parents to believe me. My furious father dragged me to the closet to prove to me that there was nothing there. He started throwing toys around my room, clearing out the closet bit by bit, yelling at me the entire time, until he pulled a poster off the wall. Behind the poster was a massive hole in the wall. My mother started screaming, and my dad pulled out a flashlight. The hole was so deep that we couldn't see where it led. Panicked, my dad ran outside to look at the exterior of the house. He found a tiny hole in the dirt at the base of the house, and after a little digging, he discovered that it was more than just a divot. It was a passageway that led from the woods directly to my room. That night, we stayed at my aunt's house, and we moved out shortly after that. I don't like thinking about this experience, but I know I'll have to face it eventually. My parents still refuse to talk about it, and I think it's because they feel guilty for not taking me seriously. It's terrifying to think that there was a stranger in my room every night for a month. I have no idea what they wanted, and I'm sure I'll never know. But if your kids come to you with something that sounds off, it's best that you believe them.